Okay.
You gonna put the screen up for the Zoom?
Sure. Okay. So it would appear that not everyone got the same information for what the readings actually were and what they were not. Read a bunch of articles, you read 0 of the correct things. If you watched an hour-and-a-half video, you watched hopefully the correct thing. The syllabus was not updated as it said it would be, unfortunately. But the instruction of just read the readings from next week, because those are the actual sources, was in fact true, but it did not get fully communicated. So here I'm just going to do an overview of that content, as if nobody got it. So some of you will be a little bit ahead, and everyone else will be 0. Those readings will be simply assigned for next week, since I didn't have anything to be assigned next week. So that actually works out well. Hello, I was Steve. And as I was just saying, the actual readings were an hour-and-a-half video at Google, and that was the most important topic, as well as the Guardian article from Paul Mason. There's another article that I don't think anyone got from Matthew Burring called Violence Voucher, and we'll make some references to that, but you'll get the actual text of it for next week. Because there's nothing to read next week, we're just going to be doing a debate on this topic. That's how we're going to do it. So, first things first, if it is digital of any form, put it away. If it is a headphone, a speaker, a tablet, a smartwatch, if it has bits and bytes, put it into a bag and not treat it until we are done with class. Okay. Thank you. All right. This is a discussion class. We are going to be discussing this. We're also recording 100% of this. So I need to take notes, don't even bother with that. I mean, take notes if it helps you. Remember, we will be recording this, and my primary reason for recording this is probably not the same reason you use it. I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to really go over everything I say. If anything is wrong, nail me on it next week. That's the purpose of the recording. So I expect that kind of interaction. The reason for that, you're going to be doing something called the Socratic Method. Anyone know what that is? Just real quick. What?
I'm not really. I think I do definition, but I have the process.
Well, what was the process then? Because it is a process. There's a technique to this, and basically is if you say something that has an assumption behind it, you're going to either need to produce a source now or produce a source later, or you will retract that statement. It is an uncomfortable situation. Nobody likes being told the thing that they have in their head is not true. Nobody. And so Socrates was, killed by his peers because he was basically disliked by them for this process. However, some of the most important tracks in philosophic history, in fact, the process of philosophy itself is the method that he described, which pissed everyone off. Which is to say, whatever your assumptions are, now I'm going to question it. Regardless of how universal you think they are, regardless of how deeply held they are, I will question them. And I will require that you produce a source. Okay? So sources are really important in this debate, which is why you not get the sources that I wanted to have coming into this is a little bit, which means you're going to have to rely on the authority of my having read them so thoroughly, I can list off the information out of them. However, if you take issue with something I say, know that it is cited, and we will keep, those sources are technically provided, and we should have that coming into this class. Okay, so, preface. Now, this is a technology class. Why do you think the entirety of the content of the sources that you were provided was about economic information? Specifically, economic information about the state of this world. Anyone that actually read or did the next week's readings want to take a stab at it? All right, quick show of hands. Who watched the Grieber video?
Google.
Yes, the authors at Google. So David Grieber was invited to Google and gave a talk on his book a few years ago. It was the new book, but now it's actually his second most recent book. And unfortunately, second to last book, because he died a few weeks ago. Very, very recent. Really sad. So that talk was entirely about debt, the history of debt, history of money, generally, but debt more specifically. So why don't we watch something that talks about the history of debt? What is it? What is debt with respect to morality? Anyone want to take a stab at this?
Well, I mean, with respect to morality, I guess you could think of something like physical, like tangible debt. That'd be something more like I did something for you, or you did something for me, so now I owe you something of what we agreed upon to be equivalent value. But then moral debt, I guess you want to think about debt in that sense. You did, oh, I did all these bad things. I expect you X amount of good in order to make up for that.
No. Come on. You think doing good things makes up for doing something
No,
bad?
I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm like, if you want to, that could be like if one definition of moral debt.
Okay, so we're talking actually about debts in the form of monetary exchange, right? The idea is that to pay one's debt is morality, and morality is paying one's debt. Sort of this old concept, and every philosophical tract that's attempted to describe the concept of debt and morality often falls into a trap of, yeah, these things are equivalent, but when you actually really think about it, no, they're really not. What does that actually mean? Is debt a fundamental part of our civilization?
So they kind of talk about how like debt was kind of is like changed throughout the years, and how it used to be like you would always keep debt because a lot of times you would never just like give someone, like, for example, if you had like a silver currency or whatever, you wouldn't give someone that silver for $1's worth of things. You would just kind of keep that debt, and then a lot of times they had like a round table where they'd be like, okay, you owe me $5, he owes you, cancellations. And then I remember there was one part where he talked about like if you tried it, like if you're paying someone, if you're not paying them less or more than what you owed them, that, like if you're paying them exactly what you owed them, then you're like saying that you don't want to deal with them anymore. Like you're trying to like cut your trails with them.
A spot transaction is antisocial fundamentally. So you mentioned something that I want to focus in on. So which came first? Money, debt, or barter? You even watched it. What's the old story? The Adam Smith story of money. Has anyone actually read Adam Smith? Basis of modern market capitalism, mostly focused on markets because capitalism came later. Adam Smith described this concept of if you have debt, right? Fundamentally, what that really means in relation to another party is that you are first equal, that you can enter into an arrangement, an agreement between two equal parties, and that, strictly speaking, it's not entirely clear if the debt isn't paid, who's really at fault? Who made a mistake here? Who bears the burden of the decision to issue the debt, to collect on it, to not collect on it? So have debts always been universal?
What do you mean by that's a universal?
Well, it is to say that debt is something that is sort of permanent, transferable, infinitely across the world. You can transfer it to any other person, but fundamentally it is impossible to imagine just making it disappear. Because right now we have an idea that debt cannot be made to go away, generally speaking. You try to get out from under your student loans, you'll find very quickly that debt is enforceable. So the modern context treats debt as literally your relation to society. What do I owe society? What does society owe me? So what that means is money, the thing that we use to transact, is, in the modern context, 100% just debt. It represents a debt earlier in the system. And money goes away when the debt is paid. So money is created by a bank. The issuer of all credit in our system is the institution we call banking. They create money, new money just poof into existence, give it to people, they spend it in the economy, they pay it back, they unpoof it on the act of paying it back. And then, of course, the interest, which is never created in the system, accumulates in the hands of the bank. So money has this sort of strange behavior, especially in modern society, in that it is fundamentally a representation of debt. But debt is not a very stable footing, as we were trying to establish. That is something that represents what you owe to society and what society owes back to you. In what way does society owe you? Oh, that's not great. So in what way does society owe you? What does society do for you? Are you members of society or are you individuals?
I mean, as they define individuals, but we definitely, I would say we're more members of society than like we have some individuality, but I mean we're more part of this larger system in terms of economics at least.
Well, yeah, I mean, economics defines the boundary between individuals. It says that you, as an individual, can only interact with the physical world when you engage in exchange with other individuals.
Well, is that only one definition of individuality of someone?
Well, I mean, we're not talking about the definition of individuals. Definitions are for another class. What we're talking about is the actions and behaviors in reality. Right now, we don't need to talk about individuals that don't currently exist yet, robots, autonomous AIs. That's not really important here yet. What's important is to understand your relationship to society. What does society owe you, and what do you owe it? Anyone think of something that you owe to society? Wow, only one of you. That's real sad.
Taxes.
Oh, that is not even a good answer. Taxes? Really? The society collects the taxes to do the things that the people are owed. Like that's the opposite. You don't owe the taxes. You are owed from society the actions paid for by the taxes. You are owed roads. You are owed a functioning state. You are owed a court system that works and is impartial. So that's what you're owed. That's what you pay for it. So, yeah.
I mean, I would say that we owe society, like most of all of anything else, it's what the resources that we take from society. Like especially Americans, we consume so many resources, and like that's a debt that we owe not really to society, it's more towards like society, like the natural world as a whole, which could be viewed, I guess, as a larger society beyond humans.
Yeah.
That I would say that's by far each individual human, at least in like at least in America, that's by far our biggest debt
So
to the world.
now here's a weird way of thinking about it though. Okay, you owe society this, but are you equal with society? Are you as an individual equal with all of society? No, obviously not.
But on the definition of debt, then we kind of would be.
Well, that's the question. Is the definition of, are we equal with society on the table, or is the validity of the debt in the first place on the table? So all this is meant to get you thinking about this problem, which is we don't have a really clear idea of who owes what to whom anymore. We never really have, is the historical context, and that's what David Gruber lays out. We never really have had solid understanding of who owes what. However, we do enforce it with laws, with property. We don't really know what we mean, but we definitely do it when we enforce property. So here's another one of the readings that you're going to go into, which is a sort of a pragmatic definition of property. It's not to draw moral arguments, that comes later, but it is merely to describe the pragmatic process of what is property, what is exchange, what do these things really mean. So, see how quickly I can summarize Matthew Burton's article. So we have this concept that he introduces us to with lots of cited references. This guy is an actual philosopher, so take your criticism and make sure you filter it through the perspective of this is someone who spent decades studying philosophy, and be careful before you simply dismiss out of hand these claims. So, there's this concept called violence vouchers. And what it is the way of describing what is property, fundamentally. Now, property in this context means not something of the physical world like we usually think it does. If I have a phone and I say it's mine, what does that really mean? If we cut the phone into teeny tiny little pieces, look at the tiny pieces, are you going to find labels that say Kevin Harrington on it? Oh boy, I hope you scientists should have a more solid answer on that. No. Now, if I engage in an exchange, trade it to Avant, is those little tags going to change names? Well, no, there's no little tag, so there's no a supernatural process that takes place in the piece of the material world when we exchange. So what are we doing? Well, let's take a closer look at this property. Let's say Ravon wants his phone, but I don't want to sell it, and he just takes it. What happens? What do I do? Well, let's flip it. I'm going to take your tablet. You walk me through what you're going to do next.
Depends on how much I will like you.
I mean, that is your point, but let's say I'm a crackhead on the street and I just walk by and I take the tablet. Let's take the personal and all of your prejudices and just throw them right in there. What are you going to do?
This scenarios, right? I'll go for someone to help me out of this situation, or I'm going to throw a punch.
Okay, so and that someone would be the police, presumably.
Police or somebody who's just walking by or something like that.
I mean, yeah, all right. So generally speaking, if you really want this resolved, you take it through the police system. Now, what does the police do when they show up? They say, right, give it back. And he doesn't. Then what does the police do? They begin violence because they have the right to initiate violence. That's what it means to be an agent of the state. The state has an exclusive right to initiate violence, and the things that we call property are your tokens, your vouchers to cash in under limited circumstances your right to initiate violence. Property, therefore, is the initiation of violence, or the intent to initiate violence. Now, the article goes into a slightly deeper analysis of this concept. So, just because all of property is violent doesn't necessarily invalidate it, now does it? You know, I need my food to eat. I need my shelter to house me. I need my clothes to keep me warm. There are things, pieces of the material world, for which I would suffer harm not having. So there's perfectly valid justifications for violence being the definition of the boundaries of property, the access to pieces of the material world. Where things become very problematic is when you look at exchanges that don't involve equal exchanges of power. Now, if the initiation of violence is power, well, then any exchange where two people exchange an equivalent amount of rights to commit violence, that means their relative power within society has stayed constant. I give you money, you give me tablet. This money is violence voucher, that tablet is violence voucher, they're equivalent. That's an exchange. So, in terms of the philosophic definition, just process, exchange is valid when it's a complete exchange. What is not valid in that context are things like rent. Because then analyze this process with respect to rent. Rent is someone leveraging their ability to incite violence in order to extort someone for power, their right to commit violence. Which is to say, I have a building, and if you pay me, you give me money for no violence voucher exchange, no piece of property is given back to you. You give me the vouchers, and in exchange, I will not initiate violence on you this month. With the tacit threat being, you stop paying, violence ensues. It's very important to understand that there are certain forms of exchange that are totally justified. And there are actually forms of exchange that are absolutely not. Now, this was meant to be what you all picked up in the readings before we got here, so we're a little behind, that's all right. Now, given this framing, when a robot makes something, who does it belong to and why? 3D printer prints it. Boise print cube, things that come out of it. Who owns it and why?
The owner of
The owner of what?
the printer,
So WPI owns all your prints?
until you exchange monetary violence with them.
Well, but here's the thing. Why does WPI own it? Did they create the value that is the thing?
They assembled the value, I guess you could put it.
Well, and this is where things get really dicey. We forgot one key concept here, which is important to this argument. So the traditional definition of property, mixing your labor with a piece of the physical world to create property in the first place. Now, the definition of what property is in the pragmatic sense does not presuppose how it was created in the first place. That goes back to Adam Smith. That's the sort of Adam Smith definition. Take a piece of the physical world, mix your labor with it, produce new property. Oh, but there's a problem with that. Anyone know what the problem is with that definition? Has anyone actually read it?
A long time ago, but I think the problem might be if you take something that belongs to someone else and then put your own method into it and then just declare that it's your property.
It does raise an important question in the modern context. What is this unowned stuff from which I can draw to mix my labor to produce new property? Back in the day, there were frontiers. When Adam Smith was writing, there were frontiers upon frontiers upon frontiers. Now, granted, there were other people living there, but they would eventually kill them all and turn it into a frontier. Property is violence. What do you want? You know, it is what it is. So they sort of killed off anyone who had a claim to it and said, all right, here's all this new land that you can claim, right? So, but again, the claim only is as valid as the government that's willing to enforce it with violence. You know, so the creation of property in the first place sort of just presupposes that there is a government that is going to impose violence on whomever to enforce your claim of property. The property is always going to be a violent act, but there was sort of this concept of, to create something, you mix your labor with the physical world, but the rest of that paragraph is actually really important. Comma, so long as, and this is the important bit, there is as much available to everyone else. Or, sorry, as much and as good available to everyone else. Which means in order to mix your labor with some piece of the physical world, then that piece of physical world must exist as good for everyone in order for your mixing of the labor to be valid in creation of new property. Which kind of is no longer the case. There isn't any ownable property anymore. So it really does raise the question, what does it mean to own things? And how do you create new property? So when the printer prints the robot, and that's, sorry, that was coming back around to that analogy again, who owns it? Who makes their labor? When a robot makes something, is there labor involved? Let's ignore for a second the 2 seconds it takes to pop the thing off the tray, because that's immaterial to the amount of time it takes to produce it. If there's no labor, who owns the things that are made? And what does that even mean? What just process that enables someone to then own?
I guess, so are you strictly defining labor as human labor?
Yes, yes.
The definition of it?
Yep, yeah, human labor. You had one?
Yeah, so the labor it took to design what's being printed counts.
Okay, so you design it, so you get one, then I print another one. And another one, and another one, and another one. And anyone who wants them can print them. So really, the design, there is labor in design, but there's no labor in copying. This is the fundamental problem of the price of information. This is where actually the Guardian article from Paul Mason goes into detail how once an object is reduced to the information it takes to produce it, whatever labor it takes to produce it is divided and divided and divided and disappears into the zero marginal cost labor of the actual production. And maybe more importantly, we have a model in society for creating knowledge without it being part of the market system, called open source. The vast majority of technology is, at its root, either open source or based on open source technology. So the creation of information, that's the thing that humans do for intrinsic value. We do it for, as an open source developer with hundreds of thousands of lines of code under my belt, I can tell you for certain, you do it. We create information, and that information isn't just information, it's productive force. So I create and distribute for free productive force every evening and weekend. Again and again, in continuous process, but more importantly, to run it, to run the code that I make, to print the parts that I design, doesn't require any labor. So there's zero marginal cost on production, if not design.
I mean,
Hold on, you've been like infinite pants back there for a while. Go.
Thanks. So I have 2 points. The first one is in response to what you just said. I think that what I'm getting from what you're saying is that there's now an imbalance in the exchange of property, or exchange of violence, as you put it, because now it costs. We create value out of we put in less value into the labor, for what we get out of it. We get more out, we get more bang than what we put in. So it's like almost property out of thin air in a way. So that, I mean, to be fair,
Value, if not
that's a better
profit.
issue. That's a better issue than if it was the other way around.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to say is that if we view ownership of property, like right, I think that we have to view ownership of property in a more in a different way, basically. Like for instance, if you look at like companies that are publicly owned, there's millions of people potentially that own a piece of that company. And like, so the ownership is not just like one entity or something, it's more of a variety. Let's say like, even for the first year example you're talking
Okay,
about.
hold on. Publicly traded company. Real quick. Publicly traded company falls under the same category as rent. Those are people that own without doing anything and receive value without putting labor in, without exchanging anything in exchange. The value that they get from ownership is a rental income, interest. It's not justified in the process that we're talking about here because it's not what it doesn't follow the narrative we use to understand it. We think publicly traded company means that they're beholden to the public, but actually it's, to be beholden to the public is one person, one vote. That's democratic process. That's what it means to be beholden, right? More to the point with publicly traded companies is $1, one vote, which just means it's an oligarchy. It has nothing to do with democracy, and it has nothing to do with the distribution of power. It has everything to do with the further concentration of power. Publicly traded companies just concentrate the wealth into the few hands of people that own publicly traded companies, which is, 53% of all publicly traded companies publicly traded assets are owned by like 0.001% of the population. Like it's absurdly shifted off to one side, and it's very, very one-sided. So yeah, don't fall into the trap of thinking that the propaganda term publicly traded company actually means that there's anything public about it. It is a very much private enterprise.
I have another example of a shared sort of pool of ownership then. We're talking about the frontier, and it's going back to what I said about like how like the debt that we have to the natural world. When we take resources from the natural world, you can say that, oh, it's unclaimed, so we're just contracting the physical world to take it. But in reality, there's other sentient creatures that depend on it. And it's not like one squirrel owns all the nuts in the forest or a specific nut. It's like it's a more of a shared pool. So I think we have to find, I think when it comes to robots and stuff like this, where the definition of ownership is more fuzzy, we consider the possibility of it not just being of ownership, not just being a strict one person owns this, one person owns this, but more of a spectrum of owning like a portion of it, or not like a physical portion of it, but of like having a degree of ownership, like different degrees of ownership between different parties of a single object.
You're bending yourself into pretzels to maintain the concept of ownership. Why can't you? I mean, just here's a phrase that I always like. The definition of wisdom is the ability to entertain an idea without accepting it. So let's just take, for the moment, let's entertain the idea that property is not, and ownership is not necessarily the way to go. And look at the examples of that not being the case. Wikipedia, Linux, the various open source projects out there, ROS, hundreds and hundreds of robots that I designed for WPI, literally 180 this term. That idea of being able to have things of actual productive value that are fundamentally open source and available to anyone. Anyone that wants that robot, want it, print it. Ownership has nothing to do with it anymore. If someone takes your printed part, print another one. Really don't. Why would the justification for initiation of violence really does drop to nothing when things are made at zero marginal cost. Because if it didn't cost you anything to just make another one, then how can you justify initiating violence on someone who just is acting on a piece of the physical world. That really is just persecuting someone you don't like simply because you don't like them. There's really no other justification there.
I mean, let's say I'm printing something, right? Let's say I print something before you
Mhm.
for a robot, and somebody comes up and takes it, right? Thing is, I spent some time on doing working on the actual process, right? I blocked considerable part of my time on that. I was that part itself is blocking other things that I want to pursue. So not necessarily, it might not have a lot of like, I really define the production cost is it's insignificant, so I don't need to print another one, right? But for me, my time, at least for me, my time is the key value that I would want to preserve.
Right. So, while that is incredibly rude, it should be seen as rude for someone to take your part. It really is difficult for me to get on board with the idea that that then justifies violence. Because that's what you really have to do. If you want to say, this is the structure we need to go with, you really do end up having to justify a lot of violence, a lot of initiation of violence. That doesn't need to be there because there is a whole other way of looking at it. You don't need violence to arbitrate this system. You simply need print queue. You know, like this is one of those very simple, just a little bit of structure, and you don't need to implement violence to solve it. Violence doesn't need to be involved in every process, but anything that involves property is violent. You know, that's the crux of the problem. And robots are changing the relationship because it used to be that you worked in order to get a paycheck. You got your paycheck to buy pieces of, or to exchange for pieces of physical world that you need to live. However, if we all watched our Humans Need Not Apply video, we know very clearly that we are the horses. Maybe we aren't. We in this room are perhaps the ones obsoleting everyone else, pushing them into obsolescence with our actions. So, you know, and I say this to the freshman class, and it always gets a chuckle, and then I like make them think about it, and the chuckle stops. The last job will be a roboticist. Who thinks they're going to beat me to it? Yeah. Okay, now you're in danger here. You are, the threat is real, and it should be real. Because there's two sides of it. One, if you're not like literally the best in the world, you're going to suffer under this just like everyone else. And number two, your actions are going to create this world that you will then live in. Your actions. Because something is very different about robotics engineers than basically any other discipline at the moment. Our decisions are going to shape the world that we live in. Really nobody else's. Politicians, they can talk, but they're not going to shape it. Computer scientists, well, they need us to make the world work anyway. You know, business majors, that whole thing is collapsing, and it's a sinking ship. Capitalism is failing. If anyone actually read that article, it's real important. Guardian article, you should definitely, well, not should, you will have to definitely read it.
Not to go too socialist and too reductionist, but based on what you're saying before, it kind of seems like the way you're defining about how the justification for inciting violence is dropping, and how that's kind of like the basis in how we treat property and how we treat property. It kind of seems in how we define property. It seems like almost like the way we define property, but just the way that this property itself, the concept as a whole, is kind of falling apart in terms of practical sense. I'm not saying that property should exist, of course, but I mean, at least there has to be some radical changes in what we define as property and what we define as something else. I guess there is a spectrum between property and fully just open, uncontained.
Right, and there's no socialism in that statement, because there's no prescribed action. So, yeah, but that problem statement is exactly what I wanted you all walking in the door with from the sources. That man, there is a fundamental structural problem in markets, property, capital, all of it, fundamental, that is indivisible from its existence. What now? So, sorry, go ahead.
Is the obsolescence of human work, is that still a problem if we redefine our relationship with debt? Because if people don't need to give stuff to society in order to be sustained by it, then is there a problem with everything being made autonomously?
Yeah, that is exactly the connection that I was hoping for. Yes, that's the connection back to the question of debt. What do we owe to our society? What does our society owe to us is changing. That is not a static question with a static answer. It is a thing that is changing, and has always changed ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Here, pop quiz. What was the first Industrial Revolution? Not what most of you think it is.
The wheel being invented or something?
Close. Anyone want to go try it?
Cotton gin?
No. Much earlier.
Early agriculture is Mesopotamia.
Bingo. Exactly. The first Industrial Revolution was agriculture. The second Industrial Revolution was the steam engine, and the third was the gasoline and electric revolution in the 50s. So, what's the fourth?
GitHub.
I mean, it's a piece of it, certainly. Open source, I would put more broadly, it's like a pretty good, if you're going to put like a 2-word answer on, what's the fourth Industrial Revolution really? Open source. But it's academically defined as the intersection between communication technology, the internet, production technology, robots and 3D printing, and societal structure. And that's the one that we haven't quite changed yet. We haven't really even thought of what that change would be or how we would go about affecting that change in the first place. So, let's do a thought experiment. We have our background on what is economics, what is money, what is debt, what is property, and the problems in the current context as we move forward. Sources being what you're going to read. Now let's do a thought experiment within this context. So before we move on to thought experiment, okay, now what? Does anyone have any other sort of burning things to say about this framing that we're going to be working? That we're going to be entertaining this as the framing, regardless of whether or not you personally accept it. We're going to entertain this and we're going to walk through it as an entertainment idea. Anyone else? Okay, good. So either you are not disagreeing with anything I've said, or nobody wants to challenge it. Yeah?
Okay, so with the idea of like e-printing, there has to be debt that needs to be like put in place just to get a printer and to get the materials to print with, like for the filament.
Let me tell you a story first before you go down this route. I see what you're saying. You say that you have to build a machine first. Okay, let's talk about a machine that I'm working on. I've been working on this for a while. It's called the Technicopia machine. Has anyone heard that word before? I have a makerspace in town named after the same thing. I coined this word a while back as a way of describing a machine. Actually, Paul Mason used a different phrase for it, called it a Project Zero. But we're going to call Project Zero is sort of the philosophical economic description of the problem, and the Technicopia machine is like an engineering project to implement to that spec. Okay? You can look at the Paul Mason as like, here's a problem. Technicopia would be a proposed way out. And it's not to say that it's necessarily a universal thing. Anyone who claims universality generally is wrong. So this is an option, and the idea is to present it as an option that every individual should be allowed to choose or not. And I'm going to build this machine regardless of whether or not you want to participate, I'm going to build it because this is my retirement. So this is how I'm going to retire. I'm going to start with a factory. Let's say a building about the size of your average Walmart. Okay? They should be readily available, you know, Walmart being a thing, Sam's Club, and all those other big box stores. But we're just going to take big empty box as a starting point, and a thing that can be found most anywhere. Now, inside this box, I'm going to build a machine. And usually you think of, 3D printers as like the one big machine that does everything. But I want you to like instead imagine the way society actually does production, which is a series of production lines that intersect and converge, with the outputs being whatever it is a civilization needs. And we're going to define needs by the same way that the United Nations does: food, shelter, healthcare, communication, education, and transportation. Okay, so get around, learn, communicate, and then your basic human needs: food, shelter, clean water. Okay, so those are going to be the required outputs of the machine. Now, does anything in that description in the outputs actually require metal or vast quantities of metal? I would argue no. An important point, because we're going to describe the inputs to the machine as the very same inputs our little friend out here, well, not little, gigantic friend out here, the oak tree, has. So when an oak tree wants to build a new branch with some leaves, does it go down to the leaf store and buy leaves? No. How does the oak tree do it?
Photosynthesis, it takes CO2 out, and then it's basically taking that carbon and building that, using that as a building block.
Now, in economic terms, is there a shortage of CO2 in the atmosphere at the moment? It's almost a joke, honestly. There is an excess of CO2. Is carbon a good building block for things? Can you make like a bunch of things with carbon? So I would fairly agree with that statement. Seeing as all of my biological life and everything that has been created, carbon. Yeah,
But not like CO2.
carbon.
But when you're talking about carbon as an atom, right? I mean, you can't just use CO2 to build stuff, like straight up. Trees can, but you can have a tree.
Right. So the first, so that brings us to the first portion of the factory. First piece of the factory is a thing called an aquaponics farm. Now, anyone know what that term is? So indoor farm. Yeah, you want to go?
Is that different from hydroponics?
Slightly. It's hydroponics where instead of injecting like chemicals, you basically have a fish tank and a series of gravel beds for nitrogen fixation. So micro ecosystem. The Biosphere 2 pioneered this. Basically, the idea being that you can sort of close the nutrient loop by just adding more creatures. More bacteria, more animals, the more diverse paths through the system, the more stable it is. And the more different kinds of crops you can grow, the better. So now there's and I used to have to tell this as a hypothetical. Now a lot of these pieces really are built in Worcester. So right downstairs from Technocopi, the makerspace, is a company building these robots that are big rectilinear sort of industrial warehousing robots, but instead of warehousing boxes of manufactured goods, they're trays of plants on dome shelves, and they bring them out to little watering areas. So instead of plumbing up a whole building, you just sort of pull out the tray and make it. So basically what it means is they have robots that from seed to harvest and all the maintenance in between are growing all the plants, with the nutrient cycle being a couple more creatures, which themselves can be outputs, food in terms of tilapia, and waste processing for, not that we like to really think about it, but we are part of that system, one of those creatures making some processed waste that the plants then consume as fertilizer. Poop is fertilizer, and fertilizer is poop. Nobody really wants to think about that, but deal with it, right? So you can make a little closed nutrient loop and treat the plants as a processed carbon mine, the same way that we would treat like a diamond mine or an iron mine. It is a mine. They mine the raw material CO2 into refined material, carbon chains, starches, and food directly, clothing slightly indirectly, most natural fibers, and then a whole collection of carbon-based materials, from high-temperature carbon fibers to wood to the plastic that we print with is literally made out of corn. Literally, PLA, made out of corn. So next up, you have your material synthesis. So you have a series of machines that, after the robots harvest the plant, process it into various raw materials for industrial processes. And then at the very end of the factory, a collection of various robots that take the outputs from material synthesis and turn them into manufactured goods. The actual product, the output from the factory. And if all the information on what this type of machine can make is just digital, it is collaborated on across the world, everyone, everywhere can work on it, and there's zero marginal cost to ship you a new design, and you email it. Need a new car? I'll email it to you. The old anti-piracy ads. If you wouldn't download a car, I absolutely would if I could. I think a lot of you would probably be in the same boat, especially if it was open source in the first place, and there was no ownership problem. So now the factory can make all the things that the human civilization needs to function: food, shelter, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. And you call it done when this factory can make all of its own parts as well. Just a simple closed loop. Now there might be some small vitamins that you still need produced in high volume silicon chips and iron cores for your motors, little things like that. Sure. There's no reason to honestly assume that an entire way of living is going to be entirely obliterated. I think a few mass-produced items probably make sense. Bolts. I think a good bolt factory is probably a worthwhile thing to have. Yeah.
So the concept is that basically the vast majority, like 95% plus of the labor and resources would be made like purely autonomously and open, and the outputs be open source, and also inputs would be virtually infinite.
Yeah, just air, sunlight and air. Sunlight falling on the top of the factory, air flowing in through the vents. And you can also assume that the only kinds of mass-produced items would themselves also be fully autonomous as well. So there's no labor on that side either. It's just, we as a society would choose to build, a mass-produced bolt factory and maintain it because we all use the same bolts. Same way we all use the same silicon processor. That would be, mass manufacture of those things, but then anything that isn't mass manufactured, and with an intent of reducing the number of things that are. So, if that's our end goal, because that's a form of society that we can A, build without destroying anything. Like, I'm going to build this machine, literally, like, not metaphorically, I'm building it in a makerspace. And so if you think about how do people gain access to it, well, it's a makerspace. It's just a better makerspace. In fact, if you sort of squint, you can see the outlines, the bones of this in Foisy, print cube. Odoo system, which I insist on for perhaps unknown reasons, but now you understand. The fact that these are open source technologies and open infrastructures for coordinating the design into productions that have two different parts: printable bits and vitamins. Vitamins being the mass manufacturing. Right now, everything's a vitamin. Everything's a vitamin. With increasingly, incrementally, that everything being reduced until it's as little as possible. Maybe for spacefaring civilizations, it'll be nothing. You know, but for us still here terrestrially, you know, why throw the baby out with the bathwater? A few mass manufactured items could make sense. As long as it's fully autonomous, no labor, nobody's forced to labor in that system. And the idea being, you have to have the choice not to be forced into doing something you don't want to do. That's kind of from individual liberty perspective, which is where I do come at this from. To give the individual actual freedom, you have to have the freedom to choose no. Like if you're forced to work, but your only choice is who you work for, you really don't have a choice. And if we live in this service economy, as we like to call it, we kind of forget that service is just a euphemism for servant. So that if you are participating in the service economy, you're a servant. So is that really the kind of structure that we want? A servant economy, where we're all just servants. That feels a bit servile, which I don't see the intrinsic value in.
How can you just elaborate more on why, if you participate in a service economy, you're servant? Can you just like highlight the definition?
Oh yeah. So I mean, it's just, you know, calling it a service economy was just wordplay. You know, we don't like admitting that we have taken people out of production and put them into servant roles. But that's really what the service economy that the United States is based on is doing. Just moving people out of production, moving them into servant roles. It's the same story that we've been told all along. It's just using the correct word finally really does put it in perspective, doesn't it? You know, it's not any different than, you know, the definitions of the word are no different, but we don't like thinking of ourselves as servants. Nobody does. I'm a servant. I don't like necessarily even having to say that, but it's fundamentally true. I serve you. You're the masters in this relationship. Yeah.
Well, I disagree with that, right? I mean, let's say one of us is being rude to you, right? Get up and leave, can't you?
I mean, could I? Imagine if a professor got up and left in the middle of a class. Like, that is the professor that will not have a job for very long. I assure you from, you know, not personal, but knowledge, experience. Yeah, that is not acceptable.
No. Or you could, if someone's breaking the class, take on a rule, or you could throw the person out, can't you?
I can, but not without consequences. Because at the end of the day, you have the power, I do not. You came here to WPI to get a degree, but that degree means that you have accepted the judgment of experts to review your work and certify your actions. However, at the end of the day, you're paying for the certificate. I work for you. You know, ultimately, I work for you. And the difference is, what you're seeing as the power dynamic that's different is that if I were to allow you to just do whatever you want and still give you a good grade, then the value of the grade, the value of the degree disappears. If I'm not an asshole to you, then you do whatever you want and the degree means nothing. You know, the grade means nothing. The certification means nothing. So I have to maintain a certain amount of, you're wrong. Like I have to be able, in my role, I have to be able to point to you and say, you're wrong. That requires two things, me knowing what's right and wrong in the context of the thing that I'm talking about, but it also has to require that you respect that answer. And if I lose the respect of that answer, then my value as a teacher is gone. So yeah, if I can't control the classroom and everyone's being rude, then I'm not a good teacher. I'm not being the servant that I need to be. I should be dismissed in exchange for someone that can do the job.
But servant never controls the master. I mean, you just
that's not entirely true. You know, slaves never control the master, but servants have a certain amount of discretion. You know, ultimately, you hire someone who's an expert to do a thing, but if you don't like what they do, you just fire them. You know, good individuals that understand their own best interest and understand the relationship that they're entering in will listen to someone that they've hired for their advice. But they're not obligated to. They are not obligated. But it doesn't mean that the advice is not going to contradict the individual who asked for it. You know, in fact, that's the definition of good advice, is being able to tell someone they're wrong in a way that they'll listen to you. Because if they won't listen, or you can't muster that action, then you really have no value as an advisor. So my job as an advisor, a servant who is advising, you know, like the vizier to a king, right? The vizier's job was to tell the king they're wrong all the time. It's like literally their job. And, you know, if they fail to do that appropriately, off with their head, right? You know, it's a bit of an extreme example, but yeah, there's plenty of examples. It's not a comfortable concept to think of yourself as a servant. I get that. But, you know, if you're not making things, you're not in production, and we as roboticists have like less to worry about than most, to be honest, because we participate mostly in the production side of the economy. However, that's not sort of a universal truth. You don't just sort of get that without having to think about it a little bit. And that's kind of the point here. So if you imagine that there is now the possibility of creating this machine, circling back, right? So if you imagine that we can create this machine, now how do we get from here to there? Sort of an interesting concept. How do we get from where everything is property and owned to build the machine in the first place, and then allow people to the option to leave the market economy peacefully and permanently for the open source system? Say what?
Yeah.
I mean, to a certain extent, yes. Literally, I would say the way you would implement that is allow individuals to control their own credit. And the mechanism for that is, it's actually relatively new. I've been searching around trying to find anyone else who's documented this. We might be, our book might be the first one that proposed this idea, which is actually kind of cool that nobody else came up with this yet. Now imagine guaranteed basic income, not just for the United States. You know, you're a human, you get an income. Everyone gets the same. Everyone everywhere gets the same. And as you implement this new income, it's going to be like a credit card based. It's not going to be based on currency. It's actually a digital transaction system. The reason for that is, same way that the Visa network charges a fee every time you swipe the card. It's a complex fee structure of how they calculate that, but just let's say there's a transaction fee on every time you swipe the Visa card. Now realize 60% of all transactions of all US dollars in the world go through the Visa network and have that fee structure attached. So I would simply propose a slightly higher fee and just pay for the basic income, 1 or 2%. Now the question, the mathematicians of you at first blush would say, well, if I receive, let's say, you know, $2,400 a month average, and I spend it all, and only 1% goes to the fee, well, how did I just pay for the whole thing? Doesn't seem to line up, does it? Question is, and this is kind of core to the understanding of economics, where does the money go after you spend it? Does it poof?
Goes to someone else.
Go to someone else. What do they do with it? They spend it. Another 2%. Okay, where does it go? Someone else. What do? They spend it. How many times does that happen in the modern economy? Anyone know? What is the depth of supply chain is the technical term that we're looking for? Between 25 and 50 transactions. Now, compounding depreciation, 50 cycles of 2%, yeah, it does go away. It goes away and then some. 25 is slightly less. So imagine just control over that percentage is just one more lever we give our central banks. Need to be entirely attacking of the old structures. Why not work with them? So you have the ability to issue everyone everywhere in the world a wage, and by taxing the transactions of that wage, you can make it disappear so that it's not inflationary. Proof new money, tax to make it disappear. Same trick as bank debt. Same trick, just playing the math a little bit different. And changing the control of who issues it. Now, instead of one bank making the decision on how all investments are made, we have this centralized Politburo style decision-making process in the United States that we call central banks, right? So we have one group of people making a very small group of 12 making the decision on how all investments are made throughout the economy. And then slightly smaller oligarchs that make the individual spending decisions. But really, the number of people that decide how the investment of the nations are made is, a couple hundred, couple thousand. Actually smaller than were made in the old Soviet Union, the Politburo. So there's fewer people making more decisions in the capitalist markets. Kind of weird. Not exactly what you would expect if you believe the propaganda. So one more piece of this, because it fixes another key concept, is the ability to self-issue debt. Now, instead of having to go to a bank to get debt, you could say, all right, let me simply take some of my future income, collapse it into a big loan, and make a purchase. Buy a house, buy a car, gather together with some friends and make a worker cooperative business. You have corporate investment, you have all personal consumer debt taken care of by the same method. And because the issuer of the currency, the issuer of the basic income, is also the issuer of the debt, you do it with zero risk. And with zero risk comes zero interest. Which means any individual can create as much zero interest debt for themselves out of their own slice of the future income. They don't have to ask or interact with anyone else in order to do it. Yeah.
Future income has to be written in some form, right? It's not just like, oh, if total amount you can just do it right now is X, right? Let's say that, right? And then you want to borrow some percent of your future income. It has to come from what other people have right now, some share of that, right?
No, you just proof more money. Remember, money and debt aren't real things. They're just numbers and ledgers. You just proof more money. Well, when you realize that's how money actually exists, it really does help dispel the idea that there's actually a scarcity of something called money. There's no more scarcity of money than there is a scarcity of millimeters to build airplanes. It's just a measurement device. You need more, you just make more. There's no fundamental thing. It's just measuring something.
Well, the point of controlling inflation, right? So let's say you just keep proofing more money. Let's say everybody wants to borrow against the future income, right? Because I can imagine a scenario where that's the case, right? And everybody thinks, oh, if I can borrow against my future income, let me buy a car right now. Let me buy a house right now. Let me buy multiple cars right now. Let me buy a boat, right? Start thinking along those lines, and they keep borrowing money, right?
Mm-hmm. But
how do you control inflation?
You only have so much future income, and putting a simple limit of 20 years out is in terms of just arbitrary structure to put in place. You can only pull up to 20 years future,
right? Cool.
And you have a finite amount of income, so there's your limit. And if you spend it all, well, then you go to a bank and declare bankruptcy like any other corporation.
Well, but then
and just wipe it out and start over.
Yeah, but then you can keep. So my point is, right? Let's say everybody's in this room, right? Starts borrowing for the next 20 years, right? Then you can right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all go buy boats, yachts, and whatnot, right? My point is, if you have all that money, how do you control inflation? Because now
the transaction tax is deflationary.
Okay, so
transaction tax are deflationary. Creating new money is inflationary. You just balance that out. And remember, supply chain depth times rate of, the elimination of money. So the other thing to think of is you just poof the new money when you give it to someone, and then when you tax it, it doesn't go somewhere. It just poofs out of existence. It just poofs into existence, poofs out of existence. That's the way bank debt works. They create new money, give it to you, then insist you give it back, because if you don't give it back, that's for some reason wrong. And they collapse the money that they had just been created. That's the way it works. So your question goes right back at you. Why don't they do that now? People do. Stupid people do. And then they have a bunch of stuff and no ability to live, and they screw themselves. Or they're smart about what assets they collect together, have produced for themselves a business, which produces an income separate from the income that they were getting guaranteed. So you start with the basic income as a leverage for entrepreneurship.
Okay, I can see that, sure.
So my question is how this system would handle a recession. If all of your income for the actual central banking authority is based on transactions, and there's a loss of faith in the system, people can just start stockpiling up their universal basic income and not spending as much money. And if people slow down spending money, that might create a deficit.
Are recessions bad? Honestly, why are they bad?
I mean, they feed it themselves and just make people spend less money.
Why is that bad?
Well, it's bad if you're giving people money and not getting it back.
No. What is bad about that?
I mean,
Literally, the reason recessions are bad is because people don't have incomes and they suffer. Anything else, the other economic activity, well, that was just the market doing their thing correctly. Good, that's the whole point. And if you have a basic income as like the stable base for society, you don't get recessions in the way that we think of them now, because recessions are the banks withholding lending, deciding my personal interest is more important than the functioning of society. They don't invest and they shut down businesses. And the only reason that's a problem is because people are paid by those businesses to live. They need them to exist. The other way to look at it is if everyone has a paycheck, 100% guaranteed, 100%, everyone, well, there's a lot of money out there for an entrepreneur that wants to capture it. And if a big business collapses, great. Room in the forest for new saplings. Recessions are, in this context, a good thing. Getting rid of the dead weight. They are the thing that we were told in the 80s they would be. Except for that, we're actually taking care of the individuals, which is the more important thing in my mind. Yep.
So I have a few quick one maybe. So it sounds like the real danger in this sort of system would be recession and production, but that's always a danger, I guess, in any capitalistic system or any system in general of societies. But also another danger of this is that this system sounds like it would be easier for people to make stupid choices financially. I'm not saying that this is not a system, but it sounds like it would be easier for people to bake up themselves because they people who use credit cards kind of sounds like that. However, there's also some
everybody's always so worried about what other people would do. Are you going to do that?
What?
Are you going to do that?
No.
Why would you assume that everyone else is dumber than you?
No, just that people do that.
Oh, but okay.
And just make
there are people with traumatic brain injury that are going to do dumb things. Like shit happens, right? That's a problem. That is society having a different problem of how do we take care of our individuals that are actively self-destructive. That's a different problem than the basic question of how is the economic structure established.
So it's a different problem, but it does that problem exactly. Yeah. So basically, this system.
Sorry, what did you say?
Exacerbates.
Okay.
Yeah, this system basically makes that problem or it makes it more destructive. I'm not saying that it's an end-all be-all of the system, but it definitely is something that should be considered.
Well, let me give you one more point. Okay, in this system, how are people like that dealt with? Honestly, those people still exist. You're talking about people that are currently today in existence. What are they doing now? Like the people that you think are going to do that, what are they doing now? Or is this an entirely a straw man? You don't even know who these people are.
I mean, I know that I know that people do get into credit card trouble and like take out too many loans and stuff. I don't know a specific example.
The people who are more likely to do that are the ones that don't make enough to actually do a living, so they're constantly having to take out loans to pay for the, like, say, electricity, rent, or house bills, anything like that. So therefore, they're just getting less and less credit because they're not able to actually pay back their credit card bills, and therefore it's a spiraling down.
Right, because there is no fundamental input to the system. The input to the system is the obligation to work. You are forced to work. You are in a forced labor system. Does that phrase rankle anyone? Does anyone challenge the idea that you live in a forced labor system? No? And you always sort of wonder what people are talking about when they say, I live in a free country. What? What freedom? Freedom to what? Freedom to not be told what to do? No, I don't think so. Free country. You know, so.
I kind of like it.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Actually. Mood lighting. Oh yeah, it looks fine on the screen. Okay. So, not everyone needs to participate in modern society in order for it to function. And this is another sort of key concept that is not widely supported, at least in Western civilization. That most people, not just like some people, but most people are not really doing anything useful. So, first of all, David Graeber has another book called Bullshit Jobs, where he sort of details out personal accounts of people that understand themselves to have a job that is bullshit. It's not like a label from the outside. It is self-described. I judge my job to be not useful for, if my job disappeared, the world would be no better off, maybe better. Maybe better. Or sorry, no worse off, but maybe better. Okay? That's about the current calculations are around 48% of all jobs fall into that category. Now, only 60% of, or 62 to 63% of people in the United States work, the rest of them being retired or children. So the vast majority of people really aren't doing anything. And those that are, 10% of all jobs in the United States are driving. Those are about to disappear. Just simply gone, not replaced with anything, gone. Now we got another 10% of the population within 15 years needs to all be doing something else. And if they're going to be doing something else, they had better be retraining for that something else now. So, pop quiz. What is the new employment that these people should be training for that's going to have hundreds of millions of jobs in the next 10 years? Really? Roboticists, really? You think there are going to be that many roboticists? I'll give you a great story about robot maintenance. I have a friend who actually maintains the minute key machines in the New England area. So, does everyone know what a minute key machine is? It's a robot. It's a robot that's
key cutting.
For key cutting. You stick your key in, it figures out what key type it is. It has a little drum, pops out a key, cuts it, spits out your key. It used to be a job. Up until about 15 years ago, it was a job. In every Lowe's, in a Home Depot, every hardware store, a human being who was skilled at running the key cutting machine was a skilled job too. It wasn't just minimum wage, it was actually a skilled job. So they paid about 1.5 times minimum wage for it. Not a great job, but it was better than minimum. Now, Ben, who is my buddy who repairs robots, has a territory that includes 563 machines. 563 former jobs are replaced by one. That's the math you should understand when you think about maintenance. And then in terms of roboticists, well, we just went over the whole one person creates it and you can copy and copy and copy. So once you, like, there is a point at which the robot job is done. You make a humanoid that can do humanoid things, game over. Ain't nothing left at that point. Nothing. Not for roboticists or people. And that's not super far on the horizon. You can perceive, if not a humanoid doing everything, we can see the jobs where the humanoids are required simply being designed in the system in the first place. Again, the Technicopia machine, you know, I'm not describing a system with people working on it or robot-shaped people or people-shaped robots working on it. No, it's a design for purpose automation so that labor is designed out of it. And that's the goal, design labor out of the system. And the whole point of the basic income concept is for you to understand that there is a path between here and what I described. Because if we had something like what I described, first of all, it stabilizes society. In the meantime, it provides a wage for the open source developers to create the information technology that will be the basis of this new society. They're going to make it anyway. We just go faster if they had not some other job they worry about. And you can see that once you get to that point of everything is produced locally, all of the supply chain shortages that we think about massive recessions, it's a local production system. Everyone has within their city 3 or 4 complete copies of a machine that can make extra capacity if there's ever a capacity shortage. So there really is not a whole lot to worry about there. The question is, how do we get from here to there?
It's one side question, right? Let's say somebody else has the same idea as you, right? But what they do is they try to make it a business, right? So rather than having it open for everybody to come in and they, you know, print whatever they want. Is that right? The aim is to capture as much wealth as possible through the process. So essentially what they're trying to do is
Charge rent, essentially.
rent or like
Well, it's an economic rent. Is what they do.
exactly, right. So you start trying to capture wealth, right? And that would be a very, if everybody like starts printing on their own things, right? And they're, oh, let me just dump things out there, right? And that person just starts taking a fee. That would be a very effective way to like, you know, like capture a lot of the wealth at a very good level, right? So essentially at that point, wouldn't it also, potentially, can it also act as a thing that's trying to avoid, like, put the wealth within like very few people?
So the question is, can you take this Technicopia machine and essentially put a wall around it and say, you have to pay me for it? Now, if that is the only machine in existence, then yes, they're using, again, let's analyze it the same way that we analyze rent with the violence vouchers. They're using the state to conduct and threaten violence against a population to force them to pay tribute in order to access something that they need. Yes, it has a name. We call it warlordism. And it is sort of the end goal for capitalism is to get to the state where you're a warlord. That's the intended use case. You get to win once you're effectively a warlord. You can do whatever you want and use your wealth as violent control of everyone around you. That's the goal. That is the goal, and that's actually my critique of, yeah, I actually think that's bad. And because I think it's bad, I don't want to do it. And because I don't want to do it, I really spend a lot of time thinking about how do we get to a world that isn't necessarily that. Now, Technicopia machine, probabilities, I would say 20%. 20% likely we get to a world with something like a Technicopia machine, project 0. That is not a high percentage. That is not, and certainly not a guarantee. I think the warlord scenario is far more likely. Yeah, you know, fascism rises and falls. It's a thing that happens in society. You know, they come and go. It is what it is. I am afraid that is the outcome that is more likely. However, because I understand where the power to make this machine really lies. It lies in your hands. And that if I can convince literally you that this is the right way to do things, then there is an opportunity for us not to have a shitty future. And that's the goal, not having a shitty future.
So big, I guess, factor that's happening is the good intentions, right? I'm assuming like people be a little more altruistic, not like focusing on just earning more money for themselves, and create that. Because I'm sure I understand, right, from the question you posed, how do we get from this capitalist society or like the capitalist nature that we have right now to a more technical vision, right? So that would require some significant changes in how we, perceive how we want to amass wealth, like how we want to live our lifestyle, or like as we grow up.
Yeah. What do you then do? And we're going to focus a lot more on your actions and your decisions in the next class. But and trust me, we'll get to that. I would have gotten a little bit further today if we had all the same background, but yes, that is a question. What do you then do? Now, I would propose first, and what I want to make sure that we complete with this class before we go back, review our sources, and come back and really grill each other next class on what is right action in this context. I just want to finish out the concept of what it is we're building here, what the process looks like. So if you describe the guaranteed basic income thing as a thing we could do today, that's like a fairly milquetoast generic policy that could be pushed through Congress with a little bit of effort. Here, anywhere. It's been in the American consciousness since Thomas Paine and the founding fathers. This was literally written by Thomas Paine, the first form of basic income. He was a Georgist, if anyone knows what that is. Georgism being referencing Henry George. And it's the idea that you tax land, that the land is owned by the state charges rent instead of tax, and the rent is used to pay a basic income. Slight modification of what I said. I don't generally propose that because that would require a radical change in the current ownership structures of land, all in one big batch, which is a great way to start a civil war that will never end. What I'm proposing is simply saying, all right, a priori property, the thing that you came in with, it is not worth the blood to fight over. The means of production used to produce it, I'm not interested in seizing any of that. No revolutions here today, please. That's not the goal. The goal is get to the point where everyone is free without some bloody violent revolution in between. Basic income is a boring answer. And boring in this context, when we're talking about stability of society, is good. Boring is gold. Get to a boring society. I want a boring society. I am sick of the news being exciting. I'm really sick of it. I think a lot of people. And I'm sick of the idea that there's nothing to do. And that, this is just markets are it, and that's so common that, especially among technologists, because we are positioned to benefit tremendously from this. Y'all are gonna get great wages coming out of here. You get paid well to build this because now you understand how fundamentally rearranging society your actions as staff at some company is. You are building the, when you work for a for-profit enterprise, you are building the element of the warlord machine. For them, the warlord, the intended warlord. Any for-profit is heading in that direction. The concentration of wealth is the definition of profit. And so if wealth is, in the form of profit is simply just another form of economic rent. Economists don't make a distinction between rent, interest, dividends, or any form of capital gains. They're the same thing. Because they have a name, unearned income. All of that stuff is unearned income. As in, you didn't do anything to earn it. You don't have a great moral justification for continuing. So when I sit back and I'm like, all right, this is what's happening, and everyone wants to defend the concept of property and defend the status quo the way it is, it's like, but really, you're not the one benefiting here. Well, why are we running around licking the boots of those at top when we are the ones who actually have the power? And that's the key point that I want to finish this out with, is how much power you have. Not immediately, but in terms of the way the structure of society is moving, irrevocably. The power is shifting out of the hands of the business majors and into the broad system. You will be making the decisions that fundamentally shape the world that we live in. You. Each one of you has way more power in your lifetime with what you choose to work on than anyone else here at WPI, university system, business, capital, finance. They can push around their violent vouchers all they want, but the nature of what those things claim, the productive capacity of society that those monies in current existence claim, you are changing the nature of that. Every day you do work, everything you do, you're changing. Now, you can't not change it, but you can choose how you change it. There's this lovely phrase that I heard actually this morning when talking with a professor in Colorado the other day, or this morning. He said, anything for which you are able to respond, if you have the ability to respond to something, you're responsible. A little bit of wordplay, but it's very true. And it's shockingly upsetting to think about. Boy, I have a lot of power to choose where to work, to choose how to spend your time. You could make a ton of money and use it to fund your open source development. You could use the fact that you get paid really well to only ever work part-time and build a better world with your power in free time. What little time you are allowed to have free from your master. Or boss, as we like to euphemize it. But it's master. You work for them. And if you don't, your ability to eat and clothe yourself and house yourself and access healthcare can be withdrawn from you by someone else. I don't believe anyone should ever have that right to take it away from anyone. That's a moral judgment of mine. I don't believe anyone has that right, or could have that right, and yet they do. Bit of a problem. So if you are the powerful ones, you are the ones who actually can make a difference in what the world is and how it plays out, then that adds a lot of weight to your decisions. Where to work, what to work on. It's not merely simply making a choice not to make weapons. And that's like an obvious bad. But there's sort of two aspects of culpability. You know, there's this legal definition and then the moral definition, otherwise known as whether you're actual cause and proximal cause. This is the legalist argument, but it plays out like this. If you were involved in the creation in some action that had a bad result, you are part of the actual cause. Morality is looking at the actual. Doesn't matter if you're slightly diffused and you could wriggle out of legal culpability because you're not proximal enough, you're not close enough to the cause to be considered legally culpable. Proximal, just how close you are to the decision making. But if you know what the consequences are, and you're actually part of creating it, you're responsible for whatever happens. However long it takes for those consequences to play out, you become responsible. Whoever it is that invented Agent Orange forever is responsible for every death. Forever and ever and ever. Whoever designed a landmine, forever and ever, morally part of the cause. And so when you make something, it is your responsibility always to investigate fully your ability to know the consequences. Choosing not to know does not absolve you of moral consequence. Yes?
Some things have both positive and negative consequences. Nuclear energy could be used for human lives, could be used as an alternative fuel. Hard to deal with that scenario.
Science is the fundamental principle, but the engineering of those two projects are totally different. The engineering project of making a bomb is different than the engineering project of making a reactor. They're different engineering projects. We're engineers. I mean, for better or worse, we're not scientists. So if you discover a scientific principle that's like knowledge in the world and how it gets applied is different than the distillation of truth. Once something is true, it's true, it just is. There is no, the scientists are the ones that don't have this big responsibility. It is the engineers that bear the weight of this entirely, because we choose to create the bomb, we choose to create the reactor. And as a nuclear engineer, your choice is, do I work on a bomb project, do I work on an energy project? Yep.
So let me rephrase the question, right? So let's say, the world is not ideal, right? Somebody has
The world's not ideal.
No, let me say it, right? So somebody, X person has X country has a hatred against Y country, right? And now this general scientific principle has been discovered, and people know that it can be used for destructive purposes. Country X, being the nice people there, decide not to pursue it, right? The country Y that hates country X, right? Let me build this bomb, right? Now, why should country X do the same to protect its own self-interest? I mean, in all fairness, I don't want to be bombed.
There's a core principle here. And this is a very old idea. Do you know who Niccolo Machiavelli is? Machiavellian Ethics, the Prince. So Machiavelli wrote this book in Florence in 1500. And it was a bombshell book at the time, because what it did is it said, as the head of the state, morality is relative to you. This is like the source of where moral relativism entered into the Western consciousness. What he said was, and it's actually important in context, is it wasn't really applied to anyone but the heads of state. He said was you must put aside personal morality and balance out the good of the state for the harm that you would do with your actions. Your actions are immoral. Well, acting as a state is not the same thing as acting as an individual, so you can justify immoral action. That's where the source of that calculus comes from. The problem with it is you can't apply that to individuals. Individuals are not states. They do not act as states, and the moral consequence of their decision making is always on them. So doing something wrong with the eventual consequence of something that you want to happen, it is not taking actually responsibility for the harm done. No good action wipes away a bad action. You can atone later, but you never undo. You can't undo doing harm, which is why looking at something and understanding the harm that you do can never be outweighed by just doing less harm or some good later. It's not a scale that you're balancing. It's an obscurity. If you do good, then you sort of get through all of this unscathed, right? You are not morally responsible for harm caused in the world. But if you do something harmful, it obscures the good. It always stands in front and never is superseded by something good in front of it. The harm always stands alone. And no amount of balancing off good acts with bad is valid in the context of morality. You're simply just doing some bad things. That's it. Those are the things you do. You know the consequences, you know what you're doing. And if you're trying to rationalize it by saying, oh, well, some other abstract good can be done, well, you just didn't think hard enough about how to do good without doing harm.
So you said it's justifiable for the state to take the action of protecting, of building weapons?
According to Machiavelli. And the whole point is, if you want to make that argument, you really have to stand on all of Machiavelli's arguments. And that is a precarious mountain.
I didn't know the guy. My point is, even if the state is justified, right?
No, the state is not justified. All right. The point being, that is the source of a lot of really bad ideas in Western society. And the idea that the state can do whatever it wants was appealing to absolute monarchs of these small principalities. Prince was the name of it. So it was a propaganda piece to try to get himself to be an advisor of one of these princes. And the end result was everyone rejected the morality at the time as being abhorrent, which it was. It was only many, many centuries later that it gets picked up by business people as like, oh, this is a great way to justify doing all sorts of harm without being held accountable for consequences. I see my firm, my private firm, as the Machiavellian state. I think we're around a long time. I want to give you a chance to say something.
I mean, I can say it for the next time.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I was going to mention that I kind of disagree with the whole good and bad thing because there's no way that you can do anything without doing both good and bad.
I disagree with that.
Like,
That's claim.
That's the thing, though. If you develop any sort of technology, once you develop it, you have no control. You really have a very limited amount of control about what it's used for. And when you develop technology, you develop a kind of a general idea of how something might work. And somebody can take that and use something.
That's science.
But developing technology, you're creating solutions to problems. It is science, but science and engineering are really intermingled in such a way that you can't abstract them out.
No. Science is the observation of the world and the distillation to rules that are true everywhere for all time. That's science. Engineering is taking those rules and then imagining ways of rearranging the world and extruding that back into reality.
So you make a mechanism that works through laws of science, but that mechanism can be general. And that general mechanism can be used for different things, good and bad. So regardless of what you're doing, there will be a butterfly effect. You can only position yourself to lean one way or the other.
No.
It can be only good and only bad.
Because core technologies, as you're describing, like an RBE, for example, general purpose technology. The question is, was it designed with the intent of the application in mind? Or was it designed with the intent of the application being learning, and that it is remixed by someone who's gaining the moral responsibility for the bad action to do some bad action?
But you provided a platform for them to begin to do bad things. That's the thing.
No,
you are the root of that badness.
That is not true. Unless, of course, it is fundamental to the technology. A good example being, guns. It's really hard to make a self-defense gun. It's effectively impossible because guns don't stop bullets. There's no way to use a gun defensively. It is a false use of language to try to claim it. You threaten someone with bullets inside of them with your gun, and that threat is intended to prevent the bullets from entering you. But really, the gun is not protecting you. It is the social relationships between you and the other person that result in either the protection or not. Guns have no defensive purpose. They're always and only a means of death.
Yeah, but let's say you have a high-tech gun with a microprocessor. You develop that microprocessor. You have some form of general technology that's used in something that is considered to be bad.
Well, the
You
micro.
developed it and it was used for that, but technically you are part of that.
Okay.
So if you didn't develop it, you wouldn't be.
But if the technology was developed only to be used in the gun, then my point is valid. If the technology is a general purpose and can be used, it's a CPU, there's CPUs everywhere. CPU manufacturers don't take on the responsibility for all the wacky things people do with them. That's the difference. The only intended use case versus a totally general purpose technology are totally different things.
In my point is you can't be a good engineer and develop something that only does one specific purpose.
We're gonna take this point. We're gonna take this point. We're gonna start with this in the next class. But it's a really good point, and this is a interesting one. Thank you very much. I'll send out an announcement tonight with a new source. Thank you. All right. Made a note, and we're going to start there.
Thank you. That was a very big.
Yeah.